The recycling bay of Station Kepler 7 hummed with the constant drone of machinery, a sound that had become as familiar to Zara as her own heartbeat. She moved between the towering piles of discarded metal and broken components with practiced efficiency, her forearms sorting materials with mechanical precision. The other workers gave her a wide berth, as they always had, their conversations falling to whispers whenever she passed. Zara belonged to the HFY, a species known throughout the galaxy for their intellectual prowess and diplomatic skills. With their elongated craniums housing enlarged brains and their graceful, willowy forms, the HFY served as mediators, scientists, and advisors to countless civilizations. They were respected, admired, sought after. She was none of those things. Born with what her people called cognitive dissonance syndrome, Zara's neural pathways fired differently than those of her kin. Where other HFY could process 17 different thought streams simultaneously, she struggled with 3. Where they could calculate hyperspace trajectories in their heads, she needed computer assistance for basic mathematics. Her telepathic abilities, the crown jewel of HFY evolution, were so weak she could barely sense the emotions of someone standing directly beside her. Her family had tried, initially. Expensive treatments, neural enhancement procedures, cognitive therapy sessions that left her exhausted and unchanged. By her 15th cycle, they had given up. By her 20th, they had quietly arranged for her voluntary relocation to the outer rim stations, where her shame would not reflect upon their prestigious lineage. Now, at 28 cycles old, Zara had accepted her place in the galaxy's hierarchy. She was good at sorting trash, at identifying valuable materials among the refuse, at staying invisible. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of as a young HFY, but it was a life nonetheless. The morning shift was nearly over when the commotion began near the main entrance. Zara looked up from her sorting table to see a crowd gathering around someone she couldn't quite make out. The voices carried across the bay, a mixture of curiosity and disdain that she recognized all too well. "Another human," someone muttered. "What are they even doing out here?" "Probably running from something," another voice added. "They always are." Zara's secondary heart skipped slightly. She had heard about humans, of course. Everyone had. The newcomers to galactic civilization, barely 2 centuries since first contact, already notorious for their unpredictability and stubborn refusal to accept their place in the established order. Most civilized species regarded them as useful but dangerous, like a tool that might explode in your hand if handled improperly. She had never actually met one. Curiosity overrode her usual caution, and Zara found herself drifting toward the edge of the crowd. Through the gaps between bodies, she caught her first glimpse of the human. He was smaller than she had expected, though that might have been an illusion created by his posture. Where most species stood tall when surrounded by potential threats, this human seemed relaxed, almost casual. His skin was darker than the pale descriptions she had heard, rich brown like the processed chocolate that sometimes passed through the recycling center. His hair was cropped short, practical, and his clothes were the standard-issue jumpsuit of a contract laborer. What struck her most were his eyes. They moved constantly, taking in everything around him with an intensity that reminded her of the predatory species she had read about in xenobiology texts. But there was something else there too, something that took her a moment to identify. Kindness. "Name's Marcus Chen," the human was saying to the station supervisor, a Valerian whose bureaucratic manner made even routine interactions feel like formal negotiations. "Contract labor, general maintenance and repair. My credentials were transmitted ahead of my arrival." The supervisor's gill slits fluttered with barely concealed irritation. Yes, we received them. Though why the station authority felt the need to accept human labor when there are plenty of qualified beings already available is beyond my understanding. Marcus's expression didn't change, but Zara noticed his hands clench slightly at his sides. "I'm here to work, sir. Nothing more, nothing less." "Indeed." The supervisor's tone suggested otherwise. "Report to Maintenance Bay 7. Supervisor Kren will assign your duties." And, human, the Valerian's voice dropped to what probably passed for menacing among his species. "This is a civilized station. We expect civilized behavior." "Understood." The crowd began to disperse, disappointed by the lack of drama. Zara started to turn away as well, but found herself frozen as the human's gaze swept across the gathering and locked onto hers. For a moment, time seemed suspended. His eyes were brown, she realized, darker than his skin, and they held hers with an intensity that made her secondary hearts race. Then, he smiled. It wasn't much of a smile, barely more than a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth, but it was directed at her. Not through her, not around her, but at her. When was the last time anyone had looked at her that way? When was the last time anyone had looked at her at all? The moment stretched until someone jostled her from behind, breaking the spell. By the time she regained her balance, the human was gone, following the supervisor toward the maintenance sections. Zara stood there for a long moment, one hand pressed to her primary heart, trying to understand what had just happened. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine activities, but her mind kept returning to those few seconds of eye contact. There had been something in his expression, a recognition that went beyond mere acknowledgement of her presence. It was as if he had seen something in her that even she had forgotten was there. When the end-of-shift alarm sounded, Zara found herself walking through unfamiliar corridors instead of heading directly to her quarters. She told herself she was simply exploring, taking advantage of her off-duty time to learn more about the station's layout. It had nothing to do with the possibility of encountering a certain human. The maintenance bay was located in one of the older sections of the station, where the walls still bore the scorch marks from the colonial wars 3 decades past. It was louder here, filled with the sounds of repair work and the occasional creative curse in a dozen different languages. Zara hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked. "Can I help you?" She spun around, startled, to find the human standing behind her. Up close, he was taller than she had thought, though still shorter than most HFY. His jumpsuit was already stained with grease and coolant, evidence of a productive first day. Zara's voice caught in her throat. When was the last time someone had asked if they could help her? "I was just exploring." "Marcus Chen," he said, extending his hand in what she recognized as a human greeting gesture. After a moment's hesitation, she reached out with one of her own hands, marveling at the warmth and solidity of his grip. "Zara," she managed. "Zara. That's a beautiful name." His tone was matter-of-fact, without the artificial politeness that usually accompanied interactions with her. "I don't think I've seen you around the maintenance bays before." "I work in recycling," she said, then immediately felt foolish for admitting to such menial employment. If Marcus thought less of her for it, he showed no sign. "Important work. Half the equipment in this bay wouldn't function without properly sorted and processed materials." He paused, studying her face. "You're HFY, right? I've read about your people. Supposed to be brilliant." The familiar shame began to rise in her chest. "Most of my people, yes. But, not you?" The question should have been hurtful, but something in his tone made it feel like genuine curiosity rather than mockery. Zara found herself answering honestly for the first time in years. "I'm defective," she said simply. "Cognitive dissonance syndrome. My neural patterns don't match species norms." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Zara braced herself for the inevitable awkwardness that followed such admissions. Instead, he surprised her. "You know what humans call that?" "What?" "Different." He smiled again, that same slight expression that had stopped her in her tracks earlier. "On Earth, we have a saying, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. But we also have another one, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease." Zara stared at him, trying to parse the meaning behind the contradictory proverbs. "Point is," Marcus continued, "sometimes being different isn't a defect. Sometimes it's an advantage no one's figured out how to use yet." "I don't understand." "Maybe that's because no one's ever tried to understand you." His tone was gentle but firm. "Tell me, Zara, what do you actually want to do? Not what your people think you should do, not what the galaxy expects from a HFY, but what you want." The question hit her like a physical blow. Want? When had she last been asked about wanting something? When had she last allowed herself to want anything beyond simple survival and invisibility? She stopped, overwhelmed by the sudden recognition of how empty her existence had become. I don't know. Then, maybe that's where we start. We? Marcus's smile widened, becoming something warmer and more genuine. I could use an assistant. Someone who knows the station, understands how things work around here. Interested? Zara felt her secondary heart skip again. I'm not qualified for maintenance work. I can barely manage basic calculations, and my motor coordination. Who said anything about calculations? Marcus interrupted. I need someone who can think differently, see patterns that others miss, identify solutions that haven't occurred to conventional minds. He gestured toward the repair bay behind him. Half the problems we deal with here aren't technical, they're logical. They require a different kind of intelligence. But, I'm different, Marcus finished. Exactly what I'm looking for. For a moment, Zara couldn't speak. The offer was impossible, ridiculous, dangerous. She would fail, disappoint him, prove that her family had been right to cast her aside. Every rational part of her mind screamed that she should walk away before she caused harm to this strange, kind human. But, there was something in his eyes, that same recognition she had glimpsed earlier, that made her believe, for the first time in years, that maybe, just maybe, someone could see value in what she was rather than mourn what she wasn't. I would like that, she whispered. Good. Marcus turned toward the maintenance bay, then paused. One more thing, Zara. Where I come from, we have another saying, the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. I think it's time you started building a stronger version of yourself. As she followed him into the maintenance bay, past the stairs and whispers of the other workers, Zara felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. It took her several minutes to identify the sensation. Hope. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Zara's head spinning. Marcus had somehow convinced Supervisor Kren to approve her transfer from recycling to maintenance assistance, a feat that should have been impossible given her lack of qualifications. When she asked him how he had managed it, he simply smiled and said that humans had a talent for creative problem-solving. Her new duties were unlike anything she had imagined. While Marcus handled the complex technical repairs, she found herself analyzing failure patterns, identifying recurring problems, and developing systems for preventing future breakdowns. It was pattern recognition work, the kind of thinking that came naturally to her even if mathematics did not. You see that? Marcus asked on her third day, pointing to a diagnostic readout from a malfunctioning atmospheric processor. The failure cascade started in subsystem 7, but the actual problem is in subsystem 3. Zara studied the display, letting her mind follow the logical connections. The pressure differential created a feedback loop, she said slowly. The system was trying to compensate for a problem that didn't exist in the subsystem it was monitoring. Exactly. Most technicians would spend hours replacing components in subsystem 7. You identified the root cause in 30 seconds. The praise made her secondary hearts flutter, but, more importantly, it made her feel useful. For the first time in her adult life, she was contributing something of value. The other workers in the maintenance bay had initially reacted to her presence with the same mixture of confusion and disdain she was accustomed to. A defective Kethvar working alongside an unpredictable human was apparently too much for their sensibilities. But, as the days passed and Marcus consistently solved problems faster with her assistance than he had without it, their attitudes began to shift from open hostility to grudging acceptance. It was Supervisor Kren who provided the real test of her new role. The Thorian was known for his attention to detail and his intolerance for inefficiency. When he approached their workstation on the 5th day, Zara felt her old fears rising. Human Chen, Kren's voice carried its usual bureaucratic authority. Your productivity reports are unusual. Marcus looked up from the plasma coupling he was calibrating. Unusual how, sir? Your repair completion rate has increased by 47% since the Kethvar began assisting you. Your diagnostic accuracy has improved by 62%. Your material waste has decreased by 38%. Zara held her breath, waiting for the inevitable criticism. "Explain this improvement," Kren demanded. Marcus gestured toward Zara with a confidence that amazed her. "My assistant has a unique approach to problem solving. She identifies systemic issues that traditional diagnostic methods miss." "Impossible. The individual is classified as cognitively impaired." "With respect, sir," Marcus's tone remained perfectly professional despite the insult, "the classification system might be flawed." The silence that followed was deafening. Challenging established classifications was not done, especially not by contract labor, and especially not in defense of someone like Zara. She waited for Kren to terminate both their positions. Instead, the Thorian studied the diagnostic reports more carefully. "Show me," he said finally. What followed was the most intense hour of Zara's life. With Marcus's encouragement, she walked Supervisor Kren through her analytical process, explaining how she identified patterns that conventional systems missed, demonstrating techniques for root cause analysis that she had developed instinctively. Throughout the presentation, she was acutely aware of her limitations. Her explanations were sometimes unclear, her terminology imprecise. Several times she had to stop and think through connections that a normal Kethvar would have grasped immediately. But Kren listened. When she finished, the supervisor was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "Unconventional," he said. "But effective." He turned to Marcus. "You will document these procedures for implementation by other repair teams. The Kethvar will assist in training sessions." As Kren walked away, Zara sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by what had just happened. Not only had she not been dismissed, she had been asked to teach others. "How?" she whispered. Marcus sat down beside her, his expression gentle. "You stopped thinking about what you couldn't do and started focusing on what you could do. That's the difference between weakness and strength, not in your abilities, but in how you see yourself." That evening, as Zara made her way back to her quarters, she noticed something different about the corridors. The whispers were still there, but they had changed in tone. Instead of pity and disdain, she heard curiosity and speculation. Word was spreading through the station about the defective Kethvar who had somehow become valuable. For the first time in years, she walked with her head held high. The transformation had begun, but Zara had no idea how much further it would go, or how much of herself she would have to rebuild before it was complete. She only knew that for the first time in her adult life, she was not facing the future alone. The weak version of herself was dying, and something stronger was taking its place. 6 weeks into her new position, Zara's world exploded. It started with routine maintenance on the station's primary power distribution grid. What should have been a simple diagnostic check revealed a pattern of microfailures that sent chills through the engineering staff. The pattern was subtle, almost invisible to standard detection systems, but Zara spotted it immediately. "This isn't random degradation," she told Marcus, her forehands dancing across the diagnostic displays. "Look at the failure sequence, it's following the same logarithmic progression in each sector." Marcus leaned over her shoulder, studying the data streams. Around them, the maintenance bay had fallen unusually quiet as other workers stopped to listen. Over the past month, Zara's analytical insights had become something of a legend among the technical staff. "Sabotage?" he asked quietly. "Worse." Zara's voice was barely above a whisper. "This is a designed cascade failure. Someone isn't just trying to damage the station, they're trying to destroy it completely." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Station Kepler-7 housed over 80,000 beings from dozens of species. It was a critical waypoint for trade routes spanning 3 sectors. If the power grid collapsed catastrophically, it wouldn't just kill everyone aboard, it would cripple commerce throughout the entire region. Within minutes, the maintenance bay swarmed with security personnel and senior engineering staff. Zara found herself at the center of attention in a way that would have terrified her just weeks earlier. Now, with Marcus standing quietly beside her, she felt oddly calm. Chief Engineer Vextar, a massive chronarian whose species was renowned for their technical expertise, towered over her workstation. "Explain your analysis," he rumbled in a voice like grinding stone. Zara had met Vexstar before, during her recycling days. He had never acknowledged her existence then, treating her with the same indifference he showed to any piece of equipment. Now he was hanging on her every word. The failure pattern is too precise to be accidental, she began, calling up holographic displays that showed the progression across multiple sectors. Each microfailure occurs exactly 4.7 standard hours after the previous one, following a specific pathway through the distribution network. Cronarian systems are designed to prevent cascade failures, Vexstar interrupted, his professional pride clearly stung. The redundancy protocols are being used against us, Zara finished. Whoever designed this attack understands our systems better than we do. They're using the redundancy protocols to mask the true scope of the damage until it's too late to stop. She manipulated the display, highlighting the affected pathways in stark red. Based on the progression rate, we have approximately 18 hours before the cascade becomes irreversible. The silence that followed was broken by Security Chief Mordek, a veteran Lycian whose scarred carapace spoke of decades of combat experience. Can you identify the saboteur? Zara felt her confidence waver. This was moving far beyond her expertise into areas where lives hung in the balance. I can track the insertion points for the malicious code, but identifying the source would require security access I don't have. You'll have it, Mordek declared. Full access, complete cooperation from my staff. This station will not fall on my watch. What followed were the most intense 18 hours of Zara's life. Working alongside Marcus and a team of the station's best engineers, she dove deeper into the station's systems than any Kethvar had ever gone. Her unique analytical approach, combined with Marcus's technical skills and human intuition, proved to be exactly what the situation required. The saboteur, it turned out, was not an external threat at all. Chief Technical Officer Yaranth, a respected Zelanian who had served on the station for over a decade, had been systematically compromising the power grid for months. His motivation was as shocking as his identity. He belonged to a radical faction that believed stations like Kepler-7 promoted dangerous mixing of species and cultures. Isolation is purity, he declared when security finally cornered him in his quarters. Each species should remain within their designated territories, maintaining their natural order. It was Marcus who made the connection that broke the case wide open. He's not working alone, he told the assembled security team. Look at the sophistication of the attack. This required knowledge of 17 different technological standards from 12 different species. No single being, no matter how brilliant, could have managed this alone. The investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy spanning multiple systems, with cells of radicals working to destabilize interspecies cooperation throughout the galaxy. Station Kepler-7 was to be their first major statement, a demonstration that diversity and cooperation led only to vulnerability and destruction. They were wrong. Instead, the crisis proved exactly the opposite. Beings who had never spoken to each other before found themselves working side by side to save their shared home. Engineers who had maintained polite professional distance discovered that their different approaches to problem-solving created solutions none of them could have developed alone. And, at the center of it all was Zara, no longer the defective Kethvar who sorted garbage, but a crucial member of the team that saved 80,000 lives. The aftermath was overwhelming. Recognition came from every level of station hierarchy, from grateful families whose children would continue to grow up safely, from the Galactic Trade Commission whose shipping routes remained secure. Awards, commendations, and job offers flooded in from across known space. Through it all, Marcus remained her anchor. How are you handling all this? He asked one evening as they sat in the observation lounge, watching stars streak past the massive viewport. It had become their routine, these quiet conversations at the end of impossibly busy days. I don't know, Zara admitted. A month ago, I was invisible. Now everyone wants to talk to me, offer me positions, study my analytical methods. She turned to face him, confusion clear in her expression. How do you process such a dramatic change? Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring out at the stars. When I was young, he said finally, I was told I'd never amount to anything. Failed grades, behavioral problems, couldn't hold a job. Everyone who knew me expected me to end up in prison or dead before I turned 30. Zara had heard hints of Marcus's past, but he had never shared details before. What changed? I met someone who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. His smile was soft, tinged with memory. She didn't try to fix me or make me into someone else. She just helped me realize that all the things that made me different, all the things that made me a failure in conventional terms, were actually strengths waiting for the right application. What happened to her? She died. The words were simple, matter of fact, but Zara could hear the grief beneath them. Transport accident, 5 years ago. Before she died, she made me promise to keep looking for others like us, people who don't fit the mold, who get written off because they don't match expectations. Understanding dawned slowly. That's why you helped me. That's why I recognized you, Marcus corrected. You helped yourself. I just provided the opportunity. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the cosmos spin past. Finally, Zara spoke again. I've been offered positions with the Engineering Corps, the Trade Commission, even the Diplomatic Service. She paused, organizing her thoughts. But I keep thinking about what you said that first day, about building a stronger version of myself. I'm not sure any of those opportunities would do that. What would? Zara took a deep breath, voicing an idea that had been growing in her mind for days. I want to stay here. I want to help others like me, like us. Beings who don't fit their species' expectations, who've been written off as defective or useless. She turned to face him fully. I want to prove that difference isn't disability. Marcus's smile was brilliant. Now that, he said, sounds like a revolution. The proposal they submitted to the station authority 2 weeks later was unprecedented. A formal program for identifying and developing unconventional talents among station personnel, with emphasis on beings who had been marginalized due to species atypicality or cognitive differences. It would be the first program of its kind in known space. The bureaucratic resistance was immediate and predictable. Forms were filed, committees were formed, experts were consulted. Chief Administrator Thelvan, a Keltorian who had managed the station for 12 years without a single innovative policy change, seemed personally offended by the suggestion that standard personnel practices might be improved upon. Unprecedented, he declared during the formal review hearing. Dangerous. Without scientific foundation. It was Supervisor Kren who provided the crucial support. The Thorian who had initially been skeptical of Zara's abilities now stood before the administrative board with productivity reports and efficiency analyses that painted an undeniable picture. The evidence is conclusive, he stated in his precise, bureaucratic manner. Unconventional analytical approaches have proven more effective than traditional methods in 17 distinct operational areas. The proposed program would systematically identify and develop such capabilities across all station departments. But the risks, Thelvan began, are minimal compared to the demonstrated benefits, Kren interrupted, a breach of protocol that stunned everyone present. The station's recent crisis was resolved through exactly the kind of innovative thinking this program would foster. To reject such an opportunity would be illogical. The vote was closer than it should have been, but it passed. Zara found herself appointed as the director of the new Department of Alternative Intelligence, with Marcus as her deputy director and a budget that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Their first official act was to conduct a station-wide survey, identifying beings who felt underutilized, overlooked, or misunderstood in their current positions. The response was overwhelming. There was Kixera, a Zentaurian whose species was known for warrior traditions, but who had an intuitive understanding of interpersonal dynamics that made her perfect for conflict resolution. There was Tobias, another human whose inability to follow standard protocols masked genius for improvised solutions. There was Veltar, a Hrunan whose sensory processing differences allowed her to detect structural weaknesses that conventional scanners missed. Each of them had been written off by their home cultures, relegated to menial positions or simply ignored. Each of them had talents that, properly channeled, proved invaluable. Within 6 months, the Department of Alternative Intelligence had become one of the most requested consulting services on the station. Problems that had persisted for years were solved in days.
Efficiency improvements that experts had deemed impossible were implemented routinely.
More importantly, the beings who comprised the department began to change.
Confidence replaced shame. Purpose replaced aimless drift. Community replaced isolation.
"You've started something that's going to spread," Marcus told Zara one evening as they reviewed applications from other stations requesting similar programs.
"Word is getting out about what we've accomplished here." Zara looked around their office, watching her team work on solutions to problems that ranged from atmospheric processing optimization to diplomatic protocol design.
6 months ago, most of these beings had been invisible, forgotten, written off as failures.
Now they were changing the galaxy.
"The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," she said quietly, remembering Marcus's words from that first day.
"I think I understand now what that means." "What's that?"
"It doesn't mean becoming someone else. It means becoming who you really are, underneath all the expectations and limitations that others have placed on you." She smiled, watching as Kixera solved a labor dispute that had been simmering for weeks with nothing more than patient listening and creative compromise.
"The weak self isn't who we are, it's who we've been told we are." Marcus nodded, his expression proud. "And the strongest version of yourself is the one that refuses to accept other people's definitions of possible."
As Zara looked around the room at her team, her family of misfits and outcasts who had become some of the most valuable beings on the station, she realized that her transformation was complete. Not because she had become someone else, but because she had finally become herself. The girl no one had wanted was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth. And that woman was about to change everything. 2 years after the formation of the Department of Alternative Intelligence, Zara stood before the Galactic Council's Committee on Species Development, addressing representatives from over 200 civilizations. The Great Chamber on Nexus Prime hummed with the translation devices that allowed beings of vastly different physiologies and communication methods to participate in galactic governance. She was terrified. Not because of the audience, she had grown comfortable speaking to groups, explaining concepts, defending ideas. Her terror came from the magnitude of what she was proposing, and the knowledge that failure here would doom millions of beings across the galaxy to lives of marginalization and invisibility. "Honored representatives," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics, "I stand before you today not as an exception to the natural order, but as proof that the natural order has been misunderstood." The rustling and clicking and chirping that passed for murmured conversation among the assembled delegates gradually faded to silence. Behind her, a massive holographic display showed statistics that had taken her team 18 months to compile: productivity increases, innovation rates, problem-solving successes, all tracked across the 47 stations and 3 colony worlds that had implemented variations of their program. "For too long, our civilizations have defined intelligence, ability, and worth according to narrow species-specific parameters," Zara continued. "We have discarded beings who think differently, process information uniquely, or fail to meet arbitrary cognitive benchmarks. In doing so, we have not just committed individual tragedies, we have crippled our collective potential." The Valerian delegate's gill slits fluttered dismissively. "The individual makes grandiose claims. Where is the evidence for these assertions?" Zara smiled, remembering a time when such condescension would have reduced her to stammering anxiety. "The evidence, Delegate Morthak, surrounds you. Every technological advancement in the past century, every breakthrough in scientific understanding, every solution to seemingly impossible problems, they have come from beings who thought differently from their peers." She gestured, and the display changed to show a timeline of galactic innovations. Hyperspace navigation, developed by a Zentaurian who was considered mentally deficient by her warrior culture because she perceived spatial relationships in ways that others could not. Quantum communication networks, created by a Hrunan collective that included individuals whose sensory processing was deemed pathological by conventional medical standards. Universal translation protocols, designed by a team of beings from 17 species, most of whom had been rejected by their home world's academic institutions. The evidence was overwhelming, and Zara had spent months preparing for every possible objection. But she knew that facts alone would not carry the day. What she needed was to make the delegates understand, viscerally, what they were losing when they discarded their own people. 3 years ago, she said, allowing her voice to carry the weight of personal experience, I was sorting garbage on a remote station, invisible to my own people, forgotten by the galaxy. According to every metric used by my civilization, I was worthless, a genetic mistake to be hidden away until I could die quietly without embarrassing anyone. The chamber was absolutely silent now, even the usual rustling of clothing and adjustment of equipment stilled.
I am still the same being I was then.
My neural patterns have not changed. My cognitive abilities remain exactly what they were when my family exiled me.
The only difference is that someone, a human named Marcus Chen, looked at me and saw possibility instead of failure. She paused, letting the implications sink in. How many other possibilities are we discarding? How many innovations are we preventing? How many solutions to our greatest challenges are rotting away in forgotten corners because we lack the vision to see value in difference? The questions hung in the air like an accusation.
Zara watched the delegates shift uncomfortably, saw the uncomfortable recognition in eyes and optical sensors and sensory clusters across the spectrum of galactic biology. It was the Cronarian delegate who spoke first, his massive frame leaning forward with interest. The individual proposes a systematic approach to identifying and developing unconventional capabilities. What safeguards exist to prevent the exploitation or abuse of vulnerable populations? The question was exactly what Zara had been hoping for, a sign that at least some delegates were moving beyond reflexive rejection to practical concerns. The programs we have implemented include strict ethical guidelines developed in consultation with advocates from every participating species, she replied, calling up the relevant documentation on the display. Participation is always voluntary. Individuals retain the right to return to previous positions if desired. Most importantly, the goal is never to fix beings or make them conform to standard expectations, it is to find environments and applications where their unique capabilities can flourish.
And the cost? This from a Scalarian representative whose species was notorious for their financial conservatism.
Marcus, who had been standing quietly at the side of the chamber, stepped forward.
The initial investment is minimal compared to the returns. Station Kepler 7 alone has seen a 300% improvement in operational efficiency since implementing the program. But the real value isn't economic, it's in the lives that are transformed and the potential that is unlocked. The debate that followed was intense, sometimes heated, occasionally brilliant.
Delegates raised concerns about resource allocation, cultural interference, practical implementation, and long-term consequences. Each objection was met with carefully prepared responses, detailed studies, and real-world examples from the programs already in operation. But it was the testimony of the beings themselves that proved most persuasive. Kixera, now the chief mediator for the entire Kepler sector, spoke about the transformation from failed warrior to gifted diplomat. Tobias demonstrated improvised solutions to engineering problems that had stumped experts for decades. Veltar presented architectural designs that had revolutionized construction techniques across 3 systems. One by one, beings who had been discarded by their societies stood before the most powerful governing body in the galaxy and proved their worth. The final vote was scheduled for the next day, giving delegates time to consult with their home governments and consider the implications. Zara spent that evening in her temporary quarters, reviewing her presentation and trying to calm the nervous energy that coursed through her system.
A soft chime announced a visitor.
She opened the door to find Marcus, carrying 2 cups of the earth beverage called coffee that had become one of his few concessions to homesickness. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling into one of the chairs that furnished the sparse diplomatic quarters.
Terrified, Zara admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully.
Over the years, she had developed a taste for the bitter brew, though it affected her physiology in ways that would have horrified conventional Kethvar medicine.
What if they vote no? What if we've pushed too hard, too fast?
Marcus was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee and staring out the viewport at the city lights of Nexus Prime spread below them.
Do you remember what I told you that first day about destroying your weak self?
Of course. I think I had it wrong, he said quietly. I thought it was about individual transformation, about helping people become stronger versions of themselves. But, watching you today, watching all of us over these past few years, I've realized something. He turned to face her, his expression serious.
It's not about destroying weakness, it's about refusing to let others define what strength looks like.
The galaxy has spent millennia operating under the assumption that there's only one way to be intelligent, one way to be valuable, one way to contribute.
You've proven that assumption is not just wrong, it's catastrophically wasteful.
But, if the vote fails, then, we keep working, Marcus interrupted gently.
Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without resistance.
But, you've already started something that can't be stopped. The beings you've helped, the programs that are already running, the minds that have been opened, that's the real victory.
The vote tomorrow is just recognition of what's already begun.
The next morning brought a chamber packed with delegates, observers, and media representatives from across the galaxy. The vote itself was anticlimactic, a simple tally of yes and no responses from each delegation's certified representative.
But the result was overwhelming.
Of the 237 civilizations represented, 219 voted to establish the Galactic Initiative for Alternative Intelligence, with funding and support structures that would allow every member species to develop programs suited to their unique circumstances and challenges. As the final tallies were announced and the chamber erupted in the various sounds that different species used to express approval, Zara felt a strange sense of completion. Not the end of a journey, but the recognition that she had found her true purpose. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Programs launched on thousands of worlds, identifying and nurturing beings who had been overlooked or dismissed by their societies. The results exceeded even Zara's optimistic projections. Innovations in technology, art, philosophy, and social organization emerged from minds that conventional wisdom had written off as defective. But, perhaps more importantly, the fundamental relationship between individuals and societies began to shift. The assumption that difference meant inferiority was gradually replaced by recognition that diversity of thought and approach was essential for progress and adaptation. It was during a visit to one of the newer programs, on an agricultural colony world where former outcasts were revolutionizing food production techniques, that Zara received a message that changed everything once again. The transmission came from her home world of Kethvar Prime, from the Council of Cognitive Sciences, the same body that had classified her as cognitively deficient over a decade earlier. The message was brief and formal, requesting her return to participate in a comprehensive re-evaluation of diagnostic criteria and treatment protocols for cognitive variance. "They want to study you," Marcus said after reading the message. "Figure out what they missed, how their classification systems failed." Zara stared at the transmission, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also a deep sadness for the years lost, the potential wasted, the other beings who had suffered because of those flawed systems.
"Will you go?" Marcus asked.
"Yes," she said after a long moment.
"But not to be studied. To teach." The return to Kethvar Prime 3 months later was surreal.
The world of her birth looked exactly as she remembered, towering spires of crystal and metal reaching toward the stars, perfect gardens where the greatest minds in the galaxy came to think and debate and discover. But her perception of it had changed completely. Where once she had seen perfection, she now saw limitation. The uniformity that had once intimidated her now seemed tragically narrow. The intellectual achievements that had once made her feel worthless now appeared constrained by their own assumptions about what intelligence could look like. The Council of Cognitive Sciences had arranged for her to address their annual symposium, an honor reserved for the most distinguished Kethvar intellectuals. As she walked onto the stage where she had once been examined and dismissed, Zara felt the weight of history and the power of transformation. "Honored colleagues," she began, looking out at an audience of beings who represented the pinnacle of conventional Kethvar achievement, "I have returned to tell you about the greatest discovery of my life, one that you helped make possible." The irony was palpable, and she saw recognition of it in the subtle shifts of posture and expression throughout the audience. "You taught me that I was different, that I did not meet your standards for cognitive capability. You were correct on both counts. I am different, and I do not meet your standards." She paused, letting the words sink in. "What you failed to understand is that your standards are not the measure of all possible intelligence." What followed was the most important presentation of her life, not because of its audience or its implications for policy, but because it represented the complete transformation of her relationship with her own people. She spoke about the discoveries made by beings who thought differently, the innovations created by minds that conventional wisdom had dismissed, the solutions found by those who approached problems from unexpected angles. But, more than that, she spoke about worth and dignity and the fundamental right of every being to be valued for who they were rather than condemned for who they were not. The response was not immediate acceptance. HFY society was too rigid, too invested in its existing hierarchies for that. But it was the beginning of a conversation that would eventually transform an entire civilization's understanding of intelligence and ability. As Zara left HFY Prime for the last time, she carried with her a commission from the Council to establish training centers throughout the galaxy, places where the next generation of diagnosticians and educators would learn to recognize and nurture unconventional minds. Years later, when historians tried to trace the origins of what became known as the cognitive revolution, they would point to specific moments: the crisis at Station Kepler 7, the address to the Galactic Council, the transformation of HFY diagnostic practices. But Zara knew the real beginning had been much simpler. It had started with a human who looked at a forgotten being sorting garbage and saw possibility instead of failure. It had grown through the recognition that strength comes not from conforming to others' expectations but from embracing one's authentic self. And it had spread because beings across the galaxy were ready to stop accepting artificial limitations on their potential. Standing in her office aboard the mobile research station that now served as headquarters for the Galactic Initiative, surrounded by reports from hundreds of worlds where former outcasts were revolutionizing everything from agriculture to space travel, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She was no longer the girl no one wanted. She had become the woman the galaxy needed, not in spite of her differences, but because of them. And, in the process, she had proven that the strongest version of any being was not the one that conformed to external expectations, but the one that refused to be limited by them. The weak self, the one defined by others' narrow vision of worth and capability, had indeed been destroyed. What remained was something far more powerful, an individual who knew her own value and was dedicated to helping others discover theirs. The transformation was complete, but the revolution was just beginning. Across the galaxy, millions of beings who had been told they were worthless were discovering their strength. And each discovery sent ripples through space and time, changing not just individual lives but the very fabric of galactic civilization. Marcus had been right about one thing: the nail that sticks out does get hammered down. But sometimes, if the nail is strong enough and stubborn enough and supported by others who refuse to accept the status quo, it can break the hammer instead. And sometimes, breaking the hammer is exactly what the universe needs.